What's the moment you realized your partner was emotionally unavailable? I still remember the exact moment I felt my heart shatter. It was 2 a.m., and I was sitting in my dark living room with only the soft glow from my phone's screen lighting up my tear-streaked face. I hadn't turned on any lamps. Somehow, letting the darkness wrap around me made it feel safer to finally unravel. My eyes were so swollen from crying that blinking stung, and my hands shook every time I lifted them to wipe my cheeks. On the coffee table lay a half-finished mug of tea that had gone cold hours ago, a stale reminder of how long I'd been waiting. I stared at the last text message I had sent him, just a single word, "Please," followed by a string of unanswered calls. The red receipt mocked me, confirming that he had seen it but apparently decided not to respond. I thought, this is it. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep giving everything to someone who won't give me an ounce of emotional safety in return. But as I was on the verge of blocking his number, deleting his photos, and doing all those dramatic things people promise themselves they'll do when they reach the breaking point, my phone lit up. Jason was calling. Even though I was furious, heartbroken, and exhausted, I answered it, half hoping he would say something, anything, that might make me believe I was more than just an afterthought. His voice on the other end sounded distant, casual, like he wasn't calling me at 2 in the morning after ignoring me all night, but just checking in from the grocery store. "Hey," he said, as though nothing was wrong. In that moment, something inside me froze. I realized how twisted it was that I felt grateful he had called at all, as if a few minutes of his attention would magically undo the ache that had been eating me alive for weeks, maybe even for months. I wish I could say I ended it right there, but I didn't. Instead, I got pulled back in by a flimsy thread of hope. Ironic, because it reminded me of how we started. Me, always waiting. Him, always coming around when it suited him. Now that I look back, I can pinpoint 100 tiny signs I ignored, but in the beginning, I was too caught up in the fantasy. We met at a party hosted by my roommate, Rachel. She loved throwing get-togethers, so I was used to a constant stream of people in our apartment. But something about Jason made me look up from the conversation I was having and zero in on him. He had this confident but laid-back vibe, with a slight smile like he was politely amused by everything around him. We started chatting over a mix of random board games and cheap wine. It felt easy, effortless, like finding your favorite sweater in the back of the closet on a chilly day. We laughed about silly things, my obsession with coffee, his love for obscure indie films. He asked me which movie had made me cry the hardest, and I remember admitting that I sobbed uncontrollably during a Pixar film once. Instead of laughing at me, he seemed intrigued, which I mistook for empathy. We ended the night exchanging numbers, with me already daydreaming about how he might be different from anyone I'd dated. He texted first, leaving a sweet message around lunchtime the next day about how he couldn't get me off his mind. In that moment, I let my guard down. The next few weeks felt like a dream. We had late-night phone calls, those giddy, endless chats where your cheeks hurt from smiling. We discovered new restaurants together and walked aimlessly in the local park, holding hands in the crisp evening air. When I started to notice that he never talked much about his family or how he felt about serious subjects, I brushed it off. Not everybody opens up quickly, right? I told myself maybe he just needed more time. Besides, the rush I felt whenever he texted me or showed up at my door with a grin and a spontaneous plan was addictive. He would send flowers, but in a kind of casual, almost flippant way, like he was doing it because that's what people do in a courting phase. I didn't see that subtle hint of emotional distance at the time. All I saw was that I was getting attention I'd craved from past relationships that had been anything but affection. It wasn't until 3 months in that the first big red flag waved itself in front of my face. I had had a really tough day at work. My boss had singled me out for a project that was bigger than anything I'd done before, and I was stressed to the point of breaking. That same day, an old friend from high school passed away unexpectedly, and I was overwhelmed by sadness and disbelief. I needed comfort. That evening, I texted Jason, hoping he'd come over or at least call. Hours went by with no response. Eventually, I tried calling him. He picked up after a couple of rings, and I poured my heart out, explaining why I was feeling so vulnerable and how I really needed someone to talk to. His response was basically, "Oh man, that sucks. But hey, everything works out in the end. Try not to stress too much." And then he abruptly said he had to go because he had a thing with some coworkers. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, my mouth open in shock. I half expected him to text me afterward, maybe apologize or offer some comforting words, but no. Nothing until the next day, when he sent a casual, "Hey, how's it going?" message. By then, I had cried myself to sleep, feeling like I'd been emotionally abandoned, but I still didn't confront him. I kept thinking, maybe I'm being too sensitive. Maybe I should just accept that not everyone handles grief or stress the same way. Weeks rolled on. We still had good moments, the kind that made me think I was overreacting. We'd watch movies together, cook dinner while dancing around my tiny kitchen, occasionally lounge around reading or listening to music. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of genuine warmth in his eyes, and it gave me hope. I convinced myself that our connection was still strong, that maybe we were just in that awkward phase where real life starts chipping away at the honeymoon glow. Then came my cousin Lori's wedding, an event I was dreading because I'm not a big fan of huge family gatherings, especially when nosy relatives start asking questions about your relationship. But I decided to invite Jason, thinking it might be nice to have him meet my family and also help me feel more comfortable. He said he'd go, sounded enthusiastic at first, but as the wedding day approached, his texts got fewer, his calls shorter. An hour before we were supposed to leave, he said something came up at work and he might be late. I ended up driving to the wedding alone, making excuses to everyone about how Jason got stuck in traffic or he's on his way. But in truth, I had no idea if he'd show up at all. I fought off embarrassment with forced smiles. The ceremony started and I was seated next to an empty chair. I must have checked my phone 1,000 times. Eventually, I got a single text. Sorry, can't make it. Work emergency. That was it. No apology call, no real explanation. I spent the rest of the evening feeling humiliated, fielding questions from relatives who assumed he just didn't exist, or thought maybe we'd fought. But no, he just decided not to come because my life event wasn't a priority. I confronted him that night, or tried to. I called, left voicemails, texted, and all I got was radio silence. It wasn't until the next afternoon that he replied with a half-baked explanation about a crisis with a big client. In a calmer mood, I tried to explain how much it hurt that he'd bailed on such an important day. His response was defensive. I can't believe you're blowing this out of proportion. You know my job is stressful. You act like I do this on purpose. Something in me cracked then. I felt like I was screaming into a void, trying to articulate that I needed him to be there while he was telling me my feelings were excessive. I started noticing a pattern. Anytime life required him to show emotional support, he'd vanish or shut down. Whenever I tried to talk about serious issues, like where our relationship was headed, or how I felt about building a life together, he'd suddenly have to leave, or he'd crack a joke and redirect the conversation to something trivial. I'd catch glimpses of him being present, like the night we went to a small jazz club, and he held my hand under the table, gently rubbing his thumb across my wrist. Moments like that convinced me he cared, but every subsequent letdown overshadowed those brief glimpses of affection. My best friend Alyssa noticed. She pulled me aside one day and said, "You seem exhausted by your own relationship. That's not healthy." I burst into tears right there in her kitchen. Alyssa had seen me in a past relationship that was more obviously toxic, shouting matches, jealousy, but this was different. Jason wasn't openly cruel. He just wasn't there, not really. It felt like I was dating a ghost who occasionally decided to haunt my life. It was so confusing because there wasn't a tangible villain moment, just an ongoing emptiness. I tried to fix things. I planned a weekend trip to a cabin near a lake, envisioning cozy fireside chats, stargazing, and deep conversations away from our daily routines. At first, he seemed excited about it, but a few days before we were supposed to leave, he started dropping hints that he might have to bail due to some nebulous work I tried to remain calm, hoping he would realize how important this was. We ended up going, but he arrived almost 8 hours late. I spent that entire first day in the cabin alone, hiking by myself, cooking dinner for one, and trying not to cry whenever I thought about how this was supposed to be a romantic escape. When he finally showed up, he walked in like it was no big deal, gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, and said he was starving. We ate dinner in near silence. I tried to talk about how I'd spent the day, but he nodded absent-mindedly, scrolling through his phone. Later that night, I brought out some wine and started asking him about his simple things like his favorite holiday memories. He answered in vague, single-sentence responses, eventually turning the questions back on me. Even then, he didn't really listen to my answers. He just stared at the wall or occasionally at his phone. The entire weekend, I felt more alone with him than I would have if I'd just gone by myself. It was like that for months, me investing more energy, him occasionally giving breadcrumbs of attention. Each time I'd reach a limit, I'd think about leaving, but then he'd do something sweet, like send me a random thinking of you text, or show up with groceries and say, "Figured you wouldn't have time to shop." Those moments were just enough to keep me tethered, making me doubt my judgment. My self-esteem took a nosedive. I started wondering if I was too needy, too emotional, or expecting too much. I told myself that maybe some people just aren't sappy, and that was okay. But I kept ignoring the difference between not being sappy and not being emotionally available at all. One evening, Alyssa convinced me to go to a small gathering at her apartment. She'd invited a handful of friends, including her cousin Matt, who happened to be a therapist. After a few drinks, I ended up sharing bits and pieces of my situation. I felt weird talking about Jason in front of a stranger, but Matt listened intently, nodding. He gently pointed out that there's a difference between someone being independent or introverted and someone failing to acknowledge your emotional needs entirely. It stung because it was exactly what I needed to hear. I realized I had been making excuses, rewriting the script in my head to avoid the painful truth. A major turning point came when I lost my job due to company downsizing. I was devastated. That job had been my anchor, my financial stability, and a big part of my identity. I called Jason right after I got the news. My voice was trembling, and I could barely get the words out. His reaction was so flat it made my skin prickle with an unsettling chill. "Oh," he said, "that sucks. So what are you gonna do now?" I felt my heart. That was it. No reassurance, no, "I'm sorry," no, "Are you okay?" I tried to keep my composure and said I didn't know yet, that I was still in shock and needed a minute to process. He didn't ask to come over. He didn't offer to meet up or even call me later to check in. By the time I hung up, my tears were rolling down my face in disbelief. I ended up calling Alyssa and crying my eyes out while she told me it was going to be okay. She reminded me I still had a savings cushion, and we made a plan for my next steps. She was doing exactly what I had prayed Jason would do. I wish I could say that was the final straw. But as most people who've been in emotionally bankrupt relationships know, it's rarely just one event that opens your eyes for good. We're resilient beings when it comes to hope. We cling to the positives, thinking maybe the next day, the next week, the next month will be better. And sometimes it was. Jason would act all concerned out of nowhere, asking how my job search was going, suggesting a relaxing night in. But even in those moments, I could sense he was just checking a box labeled emotional support, not genuinely wanting to be there for me. It was like a performance he felt obligated to put on, and then he'd vanish again into his own world. Our dynamic spiraled into a series of broken plans and half-hearted conversations. We never fought dramatically. It was always this dull ache of unspoken disappointment. One day, I decided enough was enough. I had been crying in the bathroom at a networking event after realizing how alone I felt in my supposed partnership. I told myself, the next time he does something clearly insensitive, I'm going to lay down the law. I'm going to walk away and not look back. But when you're emotionally entwined with someone, it's never that simple. Even as I steeled myself, part of me prayed he would magically transform. Then came my birthday. I had told Jason about it weeks in advance. Not because I expected a grand gesture. Honestly, a heartfelt note or a special dinner would have been more than enough. But I wanted to at least spend part of that day with him. He said, "Sure, let's do something. I'll clear my schedule." A few days before, I reminded him, and he nodded with a quick, yeah, got it." The day arrived, and I woke up with an odd mix of excitement and dread, worrying he might let me down again. But I tried to stay optimistic. I took time to dress nicely, did my hair, felt good about myself for once. My friends were hosting a small gathering for me that evening, and Jason was supposed to be there. As the clock ticked closer to the start time, I got no call from him. I texted, "Hey, are you on your way?" No answer. Guests started arriving, bearing smiles, hugs, and presents. I tried to stay upbeat, greeting everyone, but my mind was fixated on my phone. An hour passed, then two. My heart sank lower with each passing minute. Everyone kept asking, "Is Jason coming?" And I had to pretend I was sure he was just running late. Finally, halfway through the night, my phone buzzed. A single text. Something came up. "Sorry." I stared at it in disbelief. No explanation, no promise to come later, just two words that slammed into me like a cold fist. I tried to hold myself together for the rest of the party, but inside, I was cracking. When the last guest left, I locked myself in my bedroom and sobbed into my pillow. It felt like I was mourning not just his absence that night, but the absence of any real emotional security I'd been craving all along. That was the night I sat up until 2 a.m., phone clutched in my hand, tears staining the screen. I must have stared at that pathetic text 1,000 times, reading it over and over, feeling the emptiness behind it. Something came up. Sorry. It brought me back to all those other moments. Waiting alone at the wedding, crying over losing my job while he shrugged, spending half a romantic getaway in solitude, feeling embarrassed by his absence around friends and family. Each memory chipped away at the idealized vision I had of. Finally, I understood that this wasn't a phase or a misunderstanding. This was who he was. Someone who simply couldn't or wouldn't be there for me on a deeper level. I sat in the darkness, tears coursing down my face, phone in hand, wondering if I should send him a final message. Maybe something like, "We're done," or "I can't do this anymore." But my courage faltered, and instead, I sent just one word, "Please." It was a plea for him to show up, to fight for us, to give me some sign of genuine emotion. I saw that it was marked as read almost immediately, and my heart soared for a second. believing he might call right away. But he didn't. 30 minutes passed. An hour. My hand started trembling with anger and heartbreak. I told myself I deserve more than this. I deserve more than his indifference. More than this eternal limbo. Just as I was about to do something drastic, block him, delete every photo, maybe even post a raw, unfiltered rant about him on social media, my phone lit up. Jason was called. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I couldn't. I hoped he'd say the words that could heal me in that moment. I answered, voice shaking, tears still fresh on my cheeks. His tone was annoyingly casual, like he was unaware of the emotional carnage he'd left behind. "Hey," he said. I closed my eyes, waiting for him to at least sound regretful or upset. Instead, he offered a half-hearted apology about the night's events, muttering something vague about having to help a friend with a big issue, and that he'd make it up to me. There was no sincerity in his voice. He sounded like he was reciting lines from a script he barely believed in. It was then that I realized I felt nothing. My chest was tight with heartbreak, but I'd crossed some emotional threshold. I was so beyond exhausted from chasing him that the chase itself had lost all meaning. I ended the call quickly, saying I was tired. Then I turned off my phone and let the numbness wash over. That numbness was a signal my mind was sending. You've run out of tears for someone who isn't going to change. The next morning, I woke up with puffy eyes and a tension head, but for once I had clarity. My mind replayed all the times he had shown me who he really was. Unavailable, distant, unwilling to share, quick to make excuses. I saw it clearly, as though a thick fog had lifted. I texted Alyssa, telling her I needed to talk. She came over with coffee and pastries, and we sat in my kitchen for hours. I vented about every red flag, every disappointment, every moment he'd left me hanging. She listened, nodding, occasionally remarking how obvious it had been to everyone else that he just didn't invest in me. Hearing her confirm what I already knew made me feel both validated and foolish. I told Alyssa that I was ready to end it. She asked me if I wanted her there for moral support, but I said I needed to do it alone. Later that day, I texted Jason, "We need to talk, face to face." He replied almost immediately with, "Sure, everything okay?" Like he had no clue about the emotional meltdown I'd had the night before. We agreed to meet at my place that evening. I spent the rest of the day gathering my courage. A tiny part of me hoped he would come in, see my swollen eyes, and realize the gravity of the situation. A tiny part of me hoped he'd apologize in a genuine way, that maybe for once he'd say, "I'm sorry I hurt you. I want to change." But deep down, I knew better. He showed up and I could see the tension in his posture. He sat on my couch, glancing around like he was looking for an exit. I told him I couldn't keep going in a relationship that gave me nothing but anxiety and heartbreak. I said how painful it was to feel invisible when I needed him the most. He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable, and all he could muster was, "I'm sorry you feel that way," that phrase. I'd heard it 1,000 times. Such a hollow, deflective statement. There was no, "I'm sorry for what I did," just, "I'm sorry you feel that way." It was all the confirmation I didn't drag it out. I calmly told him I was done, that we should part ways. He seemed surprised, maybe even taken aback, but not devastated. He said something like, "Well, if that's what you want." I nodded, my eyes brimming with tears, but my voice steady. I walked him to the door and we said our vague goodbyes. As soon as it closed behind him, I felt a crushing wave of sadness, but also a strange sense of relief. Yes, it hurt to let go of the possibility that he might someday be the partner I wished he was, but at least I was no longer clinging to a fantasy. In the days that followed, I cried a lot. I missed him, or perhaps I missed the idea of him. Those early days, the fleeting tenderness he sometimes showed. But each time I felt myself waver. I remembered that birthday, the wedding, the phone calls he never returned, the emotional void he left. I threw myself into job applications, leaned on friends like Alyssa and my roommate Rachel, who were there with hugs, wine, and comforting words whenever I felt weak. I even started therapy sessions to understand why I'd stayed so long in a relationship that made me feel alone. Turns out, I had a deep fear of abandonment, and I clung to even the smallest scraps of attention. But therapy helped me see that I deserved real partnership, not breadcrumbs. Sometimes I'll catch myself reminiscing about the fun times with Jason, like the time we danced in the kitchen making pancakes, or the random day he helped me rearrange my bedroom furniture and we ended up laughing hysterically when the bed frame wouldn't fit through the door. But then I remember the countless times I longed for emotional support and got a brick wall instead. That's when I know I made the right choice. Now, months later, I can finally say I've found a measure of peace. I'm still single, still figuring out my career path after losing that job, but I've learned how to set boundaries. I'm more aware of red flags and more willing to walk away when someone shows me consistent disinterest in my emotional well-being. I'm not perfect. Sometimes I miss having a partner to share life with, but at least I'm no longer constantly battling this feeling of emptiness in a one-sided relationship. The moment I truly knew Jason was emotionally unavailable wasn't that single night at 2 a.m., though it was definitely a catalyst. It was the accumulation of all those letdowns, all those times he refused to be present when I needed him the most. That final realization happened when I looked at the phone, saw that he'd read my plea for connection, and felt a hollow calm. It was the moment I understood he had no intention of changing. And once I accepted that, I could finally let go. I share this story now not because I want pity or sympathy, but because I know how easy it is to get trapped in the gray area of a relationship that looks fine on the surface, but is empty where it truly matters. People might say, at least he didn't cheat or hit you, or he's not abusive. Maybe you should be grateful. But emotional unavailability can be just as damaging to the soul. It makes you question your worth, your sanity, your expectations. And if someone reading this finds themselves in that suffocating limbo, I hope they realize sooner rather than later that they deserve more love, more presence, more honesty. After everything, I no longer feel anger toward Jason. If anything, I feel sadness that he might keep going through life without ever really letting anyone in, including himself. But that's not my burden to bear anymore. My burden lifted the moment I recognized that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't force him to care. Emotional availability is a two-way street, and it's something he never seemed willing to provide. I'm done carrying the weight of his limitations, and in letting go, I found the beginnings of real self-love.